Let's start today with two stories. 15 years ago, I worked at a company doing telephone-based technical support helping people across the country with high-speed internet. One day, I ended up in a telephone conversation with a client related to a problem we were having in a particular city. Also on the phone was a network engineer and both of our supervisors. The engineer was emphatic that there was no problem. I had worked with a dozen customers in that city who were unable to connect. At the end of the call, I said, "If you're so sure that I'm wrong, go to the city and talk to the customers on this list. If you're right, it will only result in proving that I'm wrong and giving these customers the idea that you care about them. Nothing bad can come from it. If I'm right and the problem is growing, news will get out, and you will lose customers, and you will lose face. It's up to you." The engineer's supervisor found that convincing and ordered the engineer to fly out to investigate. They found the faulty equipment and repaired it. I was right. The network engineer was wrong. The second story is about a time not long before that. I had been using a temporary trick intended to test connections to get people up and running. I would set their IP address statically and turn off their DHCP. Our service gave each person an IP address, and the modem we used had a default setting that would block DHCP requests. I didn't see the point in leaving people in a setting that was so unstable on our system. I had been warned by an engineer that this was poor planning, but I didn't listen. I thought I knew better. Then our service got large enough that assigned IP addresses to individuals no longer made sense, and they started rotating IP addresses for our customers. Everyone that I had set with a static IP eventually lost connection and needed to be set back to a dynamic IP. When that happened to them, whomever had to fix that also had to fix whatever underlying problem existed that kept them from getting a dynamic IP. The engineer was correct, and I was wrong. It's easy to look at these two stories and come to the conclusion that a non-expert will be right just as often as an expert. That's not true. If we were to go through every interaction I had with an engineer over the 2 years I was on the contract, it would be evident that the engineer was right much more often than I was. Some of that gets obscured by the fact that most often I didn't argue with the engineer. The engineer said something and I didn't offer an opposing opinion in either words or action. It was an area where I knew I was ignorant before we started. Even laying those aside though, I am very confident that the engineer was right when we disagreed roughly 2/3 of the time. And I wasn't a noob either. I'm not a PEPCAC user. I had never set up a citywide network, but I had set up home networks and helped set up networks in classrooms at work. I had professional training in setting up local networks and practical experience that went just slightly past that. I knew what I was doing. I still wasn't right as often as the true expert. There's another aspect to the network engineer being right more often than me, though. I was working for a contractor, not the client. I didn't have access to the architecture details for the network. There was a lot that was obvious and I figured out while taking calls. Oh look! Everyone in this same town has the same subnet and gateway, and when they do a traceroute it returns a Windows NT name. What are the chances that the gateway is a server running Windows NT? Probably in a virtual machine inside a larger mainframe. That's no match for direct training and experience working with those machines that the engineers had. Even in the example I gave above, there is nothing inherently incorrect with giving a static IP. It was wrong because of the changes coming to the network. The engineer might have had insider knowledge that there were upcoming changes I couldn't know about. I'm going to say something that will cause a lot of controversy for some though. When I set customers to a static IP address, I was standing against God. Similarly, when the engineer refused to see that there was a problem where I directed him, he was standing against God. Neither of us were able to stand up against God until the end. God's truth ultimately prevailed. One of the things that I've wondered about, given the conversation that I had, was where the engineer that told me that setting static IP addresses was poor practice stood on the vote to move to dynamic IP address assignment. Was he in favor of it or against it? I have no way to know. When he told me it was poor practice, it was part of a conversation where he also admitted that it wasn't, at that time, against company policy, and that as the network was set up, at that time, it made no practical difference. He also hinted that the way the network was set up, at that time, was easier on him. The change to dynamic assignment made the network more complicated for him, but allowed us to serve more people at the same price. Recently, Pastor Alistair Begg has been caught in the crossfire after suggesting that a parishioner attend a wedding between her son and a transgender individual. Facebook and YouTube had their little IA robots hard at work trying to find ways to engage with me. Even artificial intelligence can figure out that this is something a bunch of Bible nerds are talking about, that it's stirring up controversy, and that I'm a Bible nerd with controversial views. So for the last few weeks, every time I open something up there's another review or conversation or commentary on Pastor Begg's statement. I think I'm probably going to have one of the most controversial opinions out there on this subject. The conversation was pretty simple. Pastor Begg was asked by a woman in his congregation how she should respond to an invitation to her son's wedding to a transgender individual. Pastor Begg asked if the couple knew her stance on these things, and she confirmed that they did. So Pastor Begg suggested that they go. He was not suggesting that the woman affirm the situation. He's fairly conservative and against non-traditional gender pairings in principle. He did think that the message said by refusing to go was one of pride and judgment, and that the message of love and concern said by going would be better for her Christian witness, though. The question of non-traditional gender pairing is currently one of the most contentious issues in lay-level theological discussions. Every so often, these controversial questions come up. In the 1960s, traditional religious experts stood against women going to church without hair covering. In the 1940s, traditional religious experts stood against eugenics. And so on and so forth. Sometimes the industrial theological complex is ultimately justified by history. Sometimes history ends up noting this as a time that the church changed her views. Noticing this about history always makes me think of Gamaliel's speech in Acts 5 verses 34 to 39. I'm glad that we have strong, principled, intelligent people on both sides of the debate discussing the points. I have faith in the power of truth to prevail over error in the end. That doesn't make the current reality any more comfortable for those caught in the crossfire, though. I can only imagine being a father in 1949 trying to ask my pastor for guidance dealing with my daughter, who was dating a eugenicist, or in 1969 getting advice for my daughter attending a church where the women didn't cover their heads. There is both a reality that every situation is totally unique, and that there's nothing new under the sun. This is unique because it's happening to us, and we have no more way of knowing from inside where the truth will lead us in the end. That's nothing new, though, because no previous generation ever had the insight that feels so obvious and intuitive to us looking back on those days from the future. Does that mean we do nothing? Close our eyes and plug our ears, and hope that it all goes away sooner rather than later? That's not how any previous issue was ever solved. If you're in a position to have a strong intuition on the subject, argue your point. If you're gay and you want to get married, say so. If you feel that marriage is the way it is for a reason, say so. Eugenics wasn't defeated by traditionalists shutting their mouths and letting progressive thinkers run rampant. Women didn't stop covering their head in passive, obedient silence. Pastor Begg does have this much point, though. This will pass, and when this generation's children look back on this moment with the same contempt that we look back at the disputes of previous generations, we will still need each other. Have the humility to look yourself in the mirror and admit, I might be wrong and not know it. Don't argue any less fiercely because of it. Don't flip-flop in your opinion. But when you get that invitation to the gay wedding or the Bible study on Leviticus 18 verse 22, remember that these people are more important than your political or theological convictions. That doesn't exactly tell you what to do, though. If you are invited to something that's wrong, it's wrong. No matter what it is. Just because they don't know it's wrong when they invite you doesn't really excuse them. I don't look back and say, those asking women to cover their heads were right for them. Or, those advocating to kill or sterilize anyone deemed lesser were right for them. They were wrong, and standing here in the future, all the conversation about it seems rather obvious. Remember, our descendants are going to think that all of this, however it turns out, is just as obvious. Whatever the answer is, it's staring us right in the face. If you're wrong, no matter which side you're on, you're just as wrong as your forebears. So if you can, take a moment and put yourself back in time. If you're a progressive wanting to celebrate gay marriage, imagine yourself in 1949 talking to a true believer that eugenics is right and true. The person you're talking to has the same level of reasoning you do. Whatever argument you would bring to support non-traditional gender pairing, they have a similar argument supporting the death or sterilization of those they deem lesser. After all, this is the direction that history has been taking us all along, according to everything they've read and seen. Those that don't want to are just trying to live by Stone Age principles. All the rest. There's nothing you can say that will change their mind. What advice do you give them? Do you advocate that they close their ears and stick to their convictions? Or do you suggest that they listen to other voices and get a bigger view? Do you ask that they respect those who can't honor their decision to put their children through rigorous testing to determine their suitability? Or do you suggest that they cut those traditionalists that say every child deserves love and happiness off from their lives? Now do that. If you're a conservative wanting to ban gay marriage, do the same. Imagine yourself sitting across the table from someone in 1969. They want to kick women out of the church and label them as heretics and hussies for coming to church with their hair uncovered. There's nothing you can do to change their mind. After all, this is the way it's always been, and it's scripture, and it's so obviously the way nature intended. What advice do you give them? Do you suggest that they close the doors and close their minds and stick to scripture? Or do you suggest that there might be more to this than what they've seen? Do you tell them not to go to church with their daughter with her hair uncovered and to seek a Bible-believing church that affirms their beliefs? Or do you suggest that they find a way to hold space when visiting family for another view on the subject? Now do that. Not everyone can put themselves in those shoes, though. It's hard for some people to imagine someone being so completely, and yet sincerely wrong. Even though we've all been there. If you're a progressive, and you think you wouldn't have stood for eugenics had you been coming of age in the 1940s, then I submit that you don't know yourself as well as you think. Similarly, if you're a conservative, and you think you'd have just rolled with it when women started showing up with their hair uncovered, then you lack introspection. It takes a lot to look at the mirror of ourselves in history and realize that we are just as capable of being just as wrong and doing things just as bad. If that's just not in you, I have a backup plan for you. Talk to your pastor. One of the advantages of living in a pluralistic society is that if you personally don't agree with your pastor on an issue, you can just go to a different church. This is a problem for our society, much more than it is a benefit. Our current situation for spiritual guidance is very much analogous to the situation for medical guidance before the establishment of modern medical license and practice. The wages of a practitioner is not based on their proven ability to provide spiritual guidance, but rather their ability to sell themselves as providing spiritual guidance. That's a different post for a different day, though. On this issue at least, the ability to just pick up and go to another church is an advantage. I strongly urge that if you are thinking of leaving a church over this kind of disagreement with a pastor, that you sit down and speak with them in humility first. Remember that you might be wrong, and strong feelings don't make you right. It might also be that your pastor is wrong, and having a depth of study and experience doesn't make them right. But between you and me, if I were taking bets on who is actually right, I would bet on the one with a greater depth of knowledge and experience rather than the one with the deeper feelings. That doesn't cover everyone, though. There are a bunch of people that simply don't have a strong internal sense of what to do. Once again, go to your pastor. This is one of the things that pastors are supposed to be for. When there's a controversy and the reality is uncertain, the job of your pastor is to provide clarity. I find it unfortunate that too many people have turned away from their pastors and towards their political leaders for this guidance. Our political leaders are there to establish laws. Our pastors are there for individual and collective guidance. While the two are often closely connected, there are still a lot of things that we need to address separately. Yes, your pastor might be wrong. You might be sitting in a church that will stand by their conviction to cover a woman's head or support eugenics right up until they lock the doors for good. That's fine. One of the things that took me a long time to notice is that Jesus offers to be there when we are gathered in His name, not when we are right. Matthew 18 verse 20. He even admits that some will come in His name and be wrong. Matthew 24 verse 5, Mark 13 verse 6. One does not nullify the other. We might honestly be gathered together by a deceiver, and Christ is still with us. We may get to the gates of eternity, and when Jesus hugs us to welcome us in, we may feel the hay and stubble of our stance on non-traditional marriage pairing burn away. 1 Corinthians 3 verses 12 to 13. It won't matter that we were sincere. If we were wrong, it has to go. But the gold and precious gems of our commitment to truth will remain. Jesus can meet us in that moment and say, "By the way, here's what you didn't know." Or, "This point your political and theological opponent made was actually right." Be ready for that. And know that if your position is from God, you cannot stand against it. And if your position is against God, it cannot stand against Him. Now comes the controversial part. Nothing I've said so far is particularly controversial. Even those that have a particularly strong opinion on the subject will agree that the purpose of pastors is to help us through these questions, and that no one has absolute certainty that they've got the right interpretation of Scripture and God's truth will prevail in the end. Those theologians that think going to a non-traditional gender pairing is evil also agree that pastors are there to help with these questions, and that they cannot have absolute certainty that they've got the Scripture point in this nailed down, and that God's truth will prevail in the end. Those theologians that think there's nothing wrong with doing to a wedding with a non-traditional gender pairing also agree that pastors are there to help with these questions, and that they cannot have absolute certainty that they've got the Scripture point in this nailed down, and that God's truth will prevail in the end. So none of what I've said so far is controversial. The controversial part comes next. Don't go to the internet to get answers to these questions. Go to your local pastor. There are several reasons for this. The first and most obvious is that some guy on the internet doesn't know you and your situation very well. I don't care how orthodox, correct, modern, or true his theology is, he doesn't know your situation and therefore can't really speak into it. When I spoke to the network engineer about setting static IP addresses, he was able to tell me both orthodox, don't do it, and practical, but it won't hurt anything, advice based on his knowledge of the service we were providing. He knew the situation, and he knew my situation. He knew that part of what I was graded on during performance reviews was how long I spent with the customer, so he didn't jump down my throat for not doing it the right way. Later, orthodox thought on the subject turned out to match the practical point. Similarly, your local pastor will know how people will view you if you go, or if you refuse to go, or if you invite them to host the after party. Your local pastor will know the arguments at least in favor of their position on this issue, and when you are confronted on the issue, you'll be able to direct scrutiny back to your pastor. And that's who we need talking to each other on this and many other issues, pastors. We need pastors telling other pastors, "I see what you're saying, But what about this? We need pastors telling other pastors. Oh wow, I never considered that before. We need pastors saying, I don't think that argument overrides this point though. Pastors need to make public comments on where they stand. More needs to happen, of course. Laymen need to choose pastors that match their convictions. Laymen need to discuss policy among themselves. Political activity groups need to discuss the merits and demerits of implementing various legal codes regarding this. But all of that is outside the day-to-day. What do you do when that invitation or wedding announcement shows up in your mailbox? That's between you and your conscience, and your pastor is there to guide your spiritual health the same way your doctor guides your physical health and your therapist guides your mental health. If you feel informed enough to decide what to do on your own, follow what's right and engage with whatever degree of passion you feel led to with humility. If you don't feel that you know what to do on your own, engage with your pastor humbly. If you don't have any strong feelings at all, let your pastor guide you. We don't need more people getting real-time advice on sensitive issues from random strangers from a million miles away. Whatever you do, don't go to the internet to decide what to do though.